Fantasy is such a broad genre nowadays, isn't it? Its scope has become very wide. In fact, this isn't the first time this year that I have talked about the many differences that there are in the fantasy genre. I've recently discussed the trend about how fantasy has become a bunch of aesthetics and how that has been the marketing of things, but we're going a bit more traditional today. And today, I'm not educating you on things, I'm providing my opinion. My name is Amy Rosenfeld, and we're gonna do a tier ranking of popular fantasy subgenres. Okay, yes, I know, this is different from my usual content, but as some of you may be aware, last week I missed out a video due to burnout and mental health, and did a lot of rethinking about how I can better get my whole author platform on track, because this year, due to unforeseen circumstances, I have been relatively neglectful of certain things. So just so I could get a video out to you guys that was still fun and still aligning with me and the new kind of otherworldly author direction that I want to take, we're doing a tier ranking. So now let's just jump straight into it now that I've done the whole housekeeping spiel. I didn't mention about liking or subscribing or buying my book though. I've got 5 tiers because if there were any more than that, I feel like there would only be like 1 or 2 books per tier. So we're gonna start from the bottom. At the bottom we have Makes Excellent Kindling. These are the books that I want to set fire to. Next up we have Someone Else Must Like This. It's not my cup of tea, but I don't have anything personally against it, and so I would recommend it to somebody else if their sort of tastes may be aligned with that. Then we have Not Reliable. Not Reliable is where some books in this particular subgenre are a hit and some are a miss. So to pick one up, it's been a bit of a gamble for me. Shut Up and Take My Money. These are books, subgenres that I love the ideas of, and I'm very likely going to buy them and read them. And then we have instant 5 stars. These are the ones that I'm going to automatically love, and you cannot get a rational argument about me and my opinions on this. So yes, as this is a tier ranking, I'm going to upset some people. We are just going to have to deal with that because this is an opinions video and you're allowed to have your own opinions. This is me sharing mine. The genre that we're going to start off with is high fantasy. High fantasy is usually a fantasy that takes place in a world that is not our own and is very much adjacent to the Lord of the Rings kind of fantasy that we're all very used to. If you asked me this question, say, 5 years ago, this would have gone in Someone Else Must Like This. But lately, just because I've recently discovered the subgenres within the high fantasy subgenre and the different possibilities within that, I've grown to like high fantasy a lot more. In fact, I think I've kept or continued reading more high fantasy books than I have other kinds of fantasy books, if I'm remembering that correctly. In the recent years, my high fantasy collection has grown, just because people are able to take more interesting approaches to worlds and stuff. So I'm going to put high fantasy in the tier Shut Up and Take My Money. Next up, we're going to go into dark fantasy. So this is fantasy with horror-based elements. Now, this is really weird because I hate horror, but I love dark fantasy. I did an entire video about me hating the horror genre last year for Halloween, and it was a very interesting sort of reflective to realize my opinions on it. And I think dark fantasy is another one that's quite up there for me, just because I like more darker and edgier stuff. What can I say? My favorite class in Dungeons & Dragons is the Warlock. I just like the darker edges and like the darker themes that come out of a dark fantasy. There is definitely some stuff that could be triggering for me, but that doesn't bring down the genre for me. For me, a dark fantasy would go in the instant 5 stars tier. Alright, next up, we're going to go into romantic fantasy. This is fantasy that has romance as a main and major part of the plot. This admittedly is something I haven't dived into much, but that's just because when it comes to romance in general, a lot of the times it does not hit for me. I don't often feel attachment to characters, and so when something is marketed as romantic, I instantly get skeptical, and for that reason, it goes into... I don't know if it goes into someone else must like this or not reliable, because I really liked Graceling, and that was a fantasy, a high fantasy romance, so sure, we'll put this in not reliable. I'm optimistic. I'm hoping things are going to change my mind in that sphere. Paranormal fantasy. Okay, let me explain. Back when I was before a preteen, late child, I don't know what the term is for when you're between 8 and 11 years old. In my dance class, and in that particular time, Twilight fever happened. I was one of the youngest people in my class. There was a lot of girls in there who were older than me, and every time they came to dancing, they'd wear Team Jacob and Team Edward shirts. Twilight was discussed about a lot, and with that being a paranormal romance, which is still part of paranormal fantasy, that made me instantly hate it. And ever since that has come out, every time that vampires and werewolves are mentioned in that sort of sphere, I don't like it. They all sound the same to me. I think I like more of the paranormal fantasy when like the vampires, werewolves, etc. are scary and a threat, but that falls more into dark fantasy than it does into paranormal fantasy. I recently came up with the idea to make one where the vampire in question in this book was actually the bad guy, because I missed that. So that's why paranormal fantasy makes excellent kindling, because of what it has become. It does have the potential to, you know, rise up from the ashes, but right now I just want vampires who are threats. I don't want them to be hot. Or if they are going to be hot, at least make me hate them and make them be bad guys and absolutely manipulative and predatory. I just want Curse of Strahd in a book form. We're gonna go into historical fantasy next. This is fantasy that takes place in the real world, but it takes place in the past, or it takes place in a story or a setting that is similar or meant to mimic a historical period. And fantasy is often an element in making things in the historical period happen. For me, I'm gonna put this one in not reliable, simply because a lot of the historical fantasy that is out there is not something I enjoy. Actually, in that case, it must go into someone else must like this. Because I've read, of course, historical fantasy that took place in the Second World War, and that was a very interesting take, and as someone who likes World War fiction, that appealed to me to have the dark fantasy elements in that particular case. But every other historic fantasy is like always white, always medieval or Victorian or something. There's just not a lot of historic variety, and I really wish there was. I would really like some recommendations of ones that stray away from typical historical fantasy settings, but otherwise, someone else must like this. Let's touch science fantasy. Science fantasy is kind of like a combination between sci-fi and fantasy, but in this particular case, I am also talking about it in which there is a science to the fantasy elements being described. This one I'm going to put into shut up and take my money, because this is a subgenre that there isn't really a lot of, at least not a lot that has come across my field of vision, so to speak. I really want there to be, and if I'm able to find more books like this, read them, and love them, which has been quite a rare case for me, then it's going to go into an instant 5 stars, but right now, I don't feel like that. So just shut up and take my money. I am very willing to try this. Epic fantasy. This one's most often associated with high fantasy, but I think it can span across all of them because it certainly expands into my book as a subgenre that you will later discover. Epic fantasy surrounds the actual kind of content in there. There's epic battles, epic fights, things are on a very big and grand scale. I'm going to put this one into not reliable because It depends on what else it is paired up with for me. If it's in an urban environment and it's paired up with superhero kinds of styles, then I'm not going to like it, but epic fantasy in a high fantasy setting is great, and in a lot of other things. So it's not reliable just because it depends on what's surrounding it as to whether or not I like it. Now we're going to whip out erotic fantasy. Take 7 guesses as to where this is going to go. This is definitely under someone else must like this because I am an asexual prude. I don't like sex. This isn't going to put me off if like a novel has erotic elements, if it has smut in it, but if it's like the primary reason that I'm reading fantasy, it's not for me. I don't get turned on by anything. So yeah, this is definitely something someone else is going to like. Futuristic fantasy. Again, this is something that doesn't get covered that often, but I think it's something that's really, really cool because a lot of the story ideas that I have made up align with a futuristic fantasy, a fantasy where the future exists or it's a very high-tech setting and there's still magic involved. It's adjacent to science fantasy. But you know, the entire setting is super futuristic. And more often than not, this gets categorized as science fiction, whereas I think there's a fine line, but that line still exists. Shut up and take my money, because I want to get more books like that. Portal fantasy. This may have been some of the fantasies that I was into the most growing up, probably up until I was 10 years old. 10 years old was when I made the switch into urban fantasy and contemporary-based fantasies, but prior to then, it was very much like portal-based fantasies, Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, Narnia, and a couple of other ones. And a lot of the fantasy-based story ideas I had were surrounding that whole moving into another world to discover the fantabulousness of it. And it's the first stories that I wrote and got published was a portal fantasy. I mean, instant 5 stars has got to be it, in my opinion. Fairy tale fantasy. This is often what I call all the fairy tale retellings. And for me, that just goes into someone else likes this straight away. Because saying it is a retelling of a fairy tale does next to nothing for me. Especially considering all the ones that come out, they're always Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast. There's so many retellings of Cinderella and Beauty and the Beast. We need like a lot more variety of fairy tales. I think lately there's been like retellings of like myths and folklore, which that side of things I've been enjoying, but fairy tale retellings are of course the more popular one, and it's one that I do not like. Someone else definitely likes this, and probably the actual content inside of it would be good, but because it's a fairy tale retelling, you really need to have a good reason or a good angle for me to enjoy it. And then last we have contemporary fantasy. I'm using this as a big umbrella term for any fantasy where the magic exists on Earth, or its roots stem from something Earth-like. So this includes your magic schools, your urban fantasies, your small town fantasies. This is quite big for me to unpack, because there are certain angles that I've really, really enjoyed, like small town based fantasies, but urban fantasies, there's been really huge hits for me and in terms of urban fantasy, and then really huge misses. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff in between, like magic academies. I'm going to have to make other videos to cover this, but I think for me, it's going to be not reliable just because of how big that is. And I have plans in the future to do more tier rankings like this. You see, there's so much to unpack from these 12 subgenres alone, and then there's subgenres within the subgenres, and then there's other tropes that make up genres as well, such as monsters and magic systems. So expect more of these in the future as little fun ways for me to share my fantasy-based opinions rather than just listing favorite tropes and least favorite tropes. Besides, algorithms like tier rankings, don't they? So with that, we're gonna close up the video there. I'd be very interested to see which ones are instant 5 stars and which books genres to you make excellent kindling. But apart from that, thank you for watching. You can do all the usual, the liking, the subscribing, the buying my book. It is what I describe as an epic portal fantasy with science-y elements in it. That's 3 genres on this, so there's even like a combination of genres that I could cover. Stay creative, everybody, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.